Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and we are back from a short break because I was actually at Silverstone. So we did not do a classic recap episode of the podcast. If you would like to see what I was up to at Silverstone, though, I was a guest of Pepe Jeans and Red Bull Racing, and I spent the entire qualifying day in the Paddock Club, which was really exciting. If you are watching this podcast on YouTube, you can go to the video directly on my channel that recaps the excitement. If you're listening to this podcast elsewhere, you can head to my YouTube channel. It's just at Marissa Kamari, and I'll put a link in the episode description as well. We saw pit stop practice, we had a hot lap, we had a lot of really fun behind the scenes content that you can see. And that was all thanks to Pepe Jeans and the really amazing people over at Red Bull and Ford and Pirelli. So if you would like to come along with me on like maybe the most amazing adventure I've ever had, you can do that now on YouTube. But today was in fact a very shocking and potentially controversial Grand Prix, I think, in Hungary. So let's get into it. I am recapping today with a good friend of the podcast, Lindsay. You have seen her before. You've probably seen her on TikTok and Instagram as Legally F1. And I'm excited to have her back for, let's call it a litigious race. So let's welcome Lindsay back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy that we can do this again after actually getting to meet in person at Silverstone while we were both across the pond.
I know, it was so exciting. And also, if you guys have never been to Silverstone, it is like every other racetrack, huge. And I think Lindsay and I were sitting, you and I were sitting literally on opposing ends of the track in the middle of the rain, trying to catch each other on international phone service, like a disaster. But we made it. We made it happen.
Yeah, the cell service, I mean, maybe it was better for like if you had local service, but it was rough.
I think everyone had bad service. It was like, I think close to 300 or 400,000 people at Silverstone on Sunday. So I think it's one of those classic, like everyone's trying to get to the cell tower situations.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, happy to be here and happy to talk about this absolutely insane race that we had today.
I know. I'm like, normally I feel like we dive in and we don't say, oh, this person won or whatever. But I honestly kind of want to do your like semi-raw reaction. We texted about it right after the race, but I mean, we have our 7th winner of 2024, though perhaps not in like the energy everyone would expect. How did you feel after this race?
It's mixed emotions, right? Because I do believe that up until McLaren made that mistake pitting Lando first, it was Oscar's race to win. And McLaren took that away from him. And then they were trying to make it right to give it back to him. And I'm happy for Oscar. I think he deserved that win. But because it was overshadowed by that like chaos of them having to plead with Lando to switch the positions back, it just felt overshadowed and like there was a dark cloud all over it. And I think now looking back, like after the race, it seems like both the drivers at least have come to better terms with it. And everything seems to be like a little better off, like on the relationship side than it seemed like it might be initially. But it's kind of one of those things where it's like the winner of the weekend is obviously Oscar because he got his first win, but the loser of the weekend is McLaren.
Yeah. It's also, to some degree, I almost felt like the loser of the weekend is also Oscar. Like my initial reaction was a 1 + 2 = lose. Like there was once they made that mistake on swapping the drivers in their pit stop, there was no way that anybody was going to be happy with the end of the race. And we'll get into the specifics of it, but I'm really bummed actually, because if you are in the Grid Chat server, you know that this is like the 5th race that I've randomly called the day before after qualifying. And I've been wanting, if you listen to the podcast, you know I've been wanting Oscar to win. I really have been feeling like he has earned one. He's ready. It's like, it's wild. He's only 18 months into his Formula One career, but it has felt, and you even heard in the commentary, like Oscar Piastri is finally a race winner when he's objectively the youngest person on the grid, the youngest person in Formula One at current. And he's the first race winner born this century as well, is the other big stat, which is wild. He's so young. And it's like, it sucks because it feels like, okay, yes, this is what we wanted, but like not this way, not in this tone, I think is really the right word. It's not even like in these circumstances, like he didn't win under a safety car. He didn't win for anything other than genuinely kind of earning it. Both he and Lando have said like it was an earned win. It was just a bad call on McLaren's strategy team, and it makes it into this situation where like there's an asterisk next to the win and there's no reason for there to be.
Yeah, it was all could have completely been avoided. And I think the only thing that gives me hope, so to speak, is that I don't think this is going to be Oscar's first and last win. I think that he has many more coming, and potentially even this year. So I think that next win that he gets is probably almost going to feel a little bit like even more sweet than this one, just with everything that happened this weekend. So just we've got to wait and see when the cards will align for him to have that next opportunity.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Well, let's talk about things prior to that set this race weekend up. I think objectively, McLaren has had the pace all weekend. This was not like a shock 1-2 for them. I think after practices and especially after qualifying, it definitely felt like we were looking at a McLaren 1-2 to lose. You know, like they had those positions, and it felt like it would have had to have been something disastrous for them not to have that podium. And I would also say something I did want to highlight is that I think Red Bull felt that way going into this race as well, because you also have Red Bull challenging McLaren's cooling system. They're saying we think they have an illegal cooling system. McLaren was investigated by the FIA for this, found that there was nothing illegal on the car, but they also had taped over these holes that are on the car for the last 2 races. And so I'm curious for you, because I know you follow the sort of team challenges and the FIA bits a little bit closer than I do from your legal perspective and your legal interests, obviously. If for those of you who don't know, Lindsay's not just like utilizing legally F1 to make a funny legally blonde joke. She's literally a lawyer. So I'm curious for you if you had followed that any closer, if it feels like F1 is sort of like back to being what F1 was with Red Bull and other teams as well, not just Red Bull, looking for any possible way to get an advantage.
I mean, I haven't like done a true deep dive into the regulations, into what McLaren is doing to see if they are actually doing anything wrong. But to me, it seems like 2020 and 2021 Christian Horner is back and ready to go. And this just seems to be not just what Red Bull does, but what lots of teams do when they're kind of a little bit on the back seat when they think that they shouldn't be, because I mean, Zach Brown has also done it time and time again. So I think that it's going to be interesting to follow to see if it actually gets anywhere. But I think that this is mostly just Christian trying to stir some drama and maybe throwing out a last ditch effort, because they know that their car currently isn't where it should be. And that I think their future development for the car throughout the rest of the season and into 2025 is also going to be lacking. So I think they're a little bit worried that they're starting to develop this gap to McLaren and that they're really not going to be able to make it up.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think your point of the fact that like we know the top teams do this, and actually really even further down the field, we just hear about it less because it affects the overall championship less. But like this is classic Mercedes, this is classic Toto Wolff and Zach Brown especially. And so I think like we're seeing those three slip back into the way they used to have to be when they were genuinely all competitive with each other. And I think we're just not used to it anymore, because I know some people who are watching Formula One for the first time this season are like, oh, like I thought Max wins everything. I thought Red Bull wins everything. So I think yeah, it's been interesting to watch. But yeah, I think we really are kind of like back to classic Formula One from a few years ago, which is that ironically, it's just what comes out of multiple teams being competitive in a way that they haven't been for the last 2 seasons at least. And so Red Bull is, like you said, they're sort of on a back foot that they're not used to being on. And it does seem like there are things that are wrong with the car, it's not like driver error, though we'll talk about some driver error in a second. And I think they are not the fastest on track anymore. The lap times it's McLaren. McLaren is fastest right now. And I think they're struggling with that. It's like kind of being told like, oh, there's someone smarter than you for this class now. Like you have to fight for it. It's hard.
And it is interesting because this is kind of the Red Bull is in the opposite position of the last time we saw them acting this way. When they were doing this in 2020 and 2021, they were on the up while Mercedes was like leveling out with their performance. But the fact that they're kind of doing it as this like desperate grab as they're on their way down, I think is very telling about just what the team morale is like and where they are as a team looking forward this year and into next.
It's hard because honestly, I really like Max, and it's hard to watch today, like specifically, and the energy of today. And I think it's difficult because it's like it's never fun to watch a team that like was performing so well start to crash, and like you're saying, to like be grasping at other ways to compete because they can't compete on the track in the same way that they were. There are clearly some issues with the car, with understeer, with braking, and it's frustrating. Like it's hard to watch. Like I feel bad, but there's also so much going on with Red Bull that's not just the car. So we should talk a little bit about qualifying and Checo's situation and the rumors that are kind of flying around with what looks like maybe a driver swap next year, maybe a driver swap this season. Checo is out Q1 for the second race in a row.
Not just out, crashed out.
Yeah, crashed out for the second race in a row. This was actually worse than last week, because you have last week Checo just went into the, he just beached himself in the gravel.
Yeah.
Or not last week, Silverstone, the last race. We just had Checo beach himself in the gravel, and this was like fully into the wall. And it was like such a chaotic radio situation as well, because on the feed, if you were watching qualifying, and if you weren't, I'm sure you've seen it memed across the board, like the clip is just wild, because you have Max yelling about the rain, you have GP, as I saw someone saying, gentle parenting him, like calm down. And then in the middle of it, you have the announcer shouting Perez because he goes into the wall. It's like, oh my God, like what's going on? What year is it?
That was absolute whiplash watching the commentary. And like, you always get a little bit, like, you get a little nervous when you see like the yellow flag sector, whatever, pop up. And you're like, oh gosh, who could it be? And I have to say, I wasn't expecting it to be Checo. I don't know who I was expecting it to be, but I was like, surely it can't be Checo again. And then when I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was like Ted or Crofty was like screamed, it was like, Perez. I like jumped off the couch. I was like, no, it's not. I was like, no, this is not happening so right accurate. Now.
No, I saw someone post and they were like, I can't, and I wish I had saved it because I think it was on Threads, but someone was like, I saw the yellow flag and thought, surely Checo can't be fueling the rumors like this. Like, he just can't be. Like, I was so shocked by it. And I will say, the one thing I want to say for Max, because I think a lot of the conversation around Max this weekend, rightfully so, is going to be about his attitude and about the way that he performed and the way he handled himself on team radio. But I will say, after qualifying, I did respect the way that he refused to talk down about Checo. He was asked about it. He was asked about the rumors, and he very like bluntly said, like, I'm not going to talk about that, and I think it's a shame, because he was having what I thought was quite a good qualifying beforehand. And so I will say, like, I did appreciate, I don't think he always has done this. He refused to kind of fuel the rumors against his teammate. It's very rare that Max necessarily comes out in support of his teammate, regardless of who his teammate is. So I do want to put that out there. I think he had a good media training day yesterday, just not so much today.
Yeah. And then to make things even crazier, we then had Daniel go out and top the timesheets for Q1.
Yep.
And people are like, okay, it's Daniel's seat now. And then to make it even worse, Yuki crashes in Q3. Granted, Daniel still really only ended up out qualifying him by one place, because there was really nowhere else to go aside from ninth in that Q3. Yeah. But just a chaotic Saturday for who is going to be the second driver Red Bull rumor mills.
I have to be honest with you. The Daniel Ricciardo to Checo seat rumors are so troubling to me, because if it happens, it's not performance based. Like, it is just objectively not. There are two drivers that are better than Daniel Ricciardo right now, and those are Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda. And I think, like Pierre put it, like Pierre has said, I hope Yuki was considered for that seat. I think Yuki has been asked about it point blank and said, like, it would be really weird if they give the seat to Liam. I don't think he's been asked point blank about Daniel yet, but like, it just feels, I don't know. I know Daniel's very marketable, and I get that. I get that he's charming. I get that sponsors love him. I get that he has a large fan base, but I just think numbers to numbers. And again, Formula One's not always about numbers. It's not always about performance. It is about dollar signs sometimes, and that sucks. And also, Yuki's kind of position within Red Bull past 2025, we're not sure where it'll go, given that like Honda's moving to Aston Martin and a lot of his sponsorship money comes from Honda. So like a lot of the value that Yuki brings monetarily to the team is getting ready to leave through no fault of his own. But it is hard. It is hard to like swallow if Daniel moves up into that seat. And I also have been kind of frustrated by the way the media is talking about it, because it seems like there's just no, everyone's like, yeah, like why wouldn't it be Daniel? And I'm like, based on what? Like based on what other than vibes? Like Daniel brings vibes to the table, and that's great. Sometimes you do need like vibes brought to the table, and I think Daniel was an incredible driver before his stint with McLaren. Like Daniel has had a really like victorious career. He's done a lot of really great things. I think hopefully one day he does go back to being who he used to be, and I would love for that to be shown next year or even the back half of this year, but I don't think that he has shown it now to be able to make this move for next year. It just feels insane to me.
And I mean, there's no denying the fact that he has a very close relationship with Christian Horner, and that's where this is coming from. But
yeah,
as like a self-proclaimed Yuki fan, it's just frustrating to see him get just like overlooked time and time again within that organization. And I think the fact that he said something about the rumors that Liam could potentially come into that seat just like out of nowhere, and him saying, yeah, I think that would be weird. Like, I completely agree and support him saying that, because Yuki has been with that team for his entire F1 career, proving himself. And the fact that they could potentially, not that Liam is like just coming out of nowhere, but
sure,
pluck Liam out when he's not even on the grid into that Red Bull seat, when I think Yuki has done more than enough to prove himself against Liam, against Daniel. I mean, out qualifying and outpacing Checo in these last few races. Like, I don't know what more Yuki could possibly do to prove that he should at least get a shot.
I agree. And I think like also, especially when we saw, you know, Liam did a test for Red Bull and we saw that they came back and they were kind of objectively, I believe the word was disappointed with his times that they used. And I do believe he's like, you know, he came closer to Max's times than Checo's been coming. I don't know. I think to me, if we're talking about like fair, right? We're talking about fair and we're talking about whatever. I think it makes sense to move Yuki into that seat, to give Daniel one more shot, and to put Liam in the other seat. Like, let that kind of handle, and giving Daniel the one more shot is, I think, like really a situation of last year was a weird year. He came in the middle of the season, he was injured, he went out, Liam came in. There was a lot of conversation about whether Liam should have been kicked back out or if Daniel should have taken it. It even got like a little bit of a storyline on Drive to Survive. We saw that Liam was very much not happy about it, and I think like, okay, fine, if you want to see if Daniel can bring himself back properly, if you want to give him one more season, let him fight it out with Liam. Let Yuki move into that seat and really show. I think Yuki has shown himself to be a much better teammate. He's matured, he has performed really well, and he's outperformed his teammates. He's outperformed Checo in quali, and I think that's what I would do. I'm obviously not in charge. And also, again, I think for people who are new to Formula One, this is one of those sports where it's not really about fair, it's not really about record, it's about like so many factors outside of that. And so if it is Daniel, it is very, to me, clearly about those factors, not about fair, quote unquote, or performance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything to add, because I think that's exactly how, in my mind, how it should play out as well too.
Justice for Yuki. I remain
always
Yuki
justice
stan.
for Yuki. He posted his Instagram post where he was like all smiley. I was like, when Yuki's happy, I'm happy. Like, nothing warms my heart more than like a happy Yuki post on Instagram.
Honestly, this is just like a chemistry thing. I think Yuki and Max put out some of the best social media content. Like, Max and Daniel put out really good, like, kind of press content in general, because they're such polar opposites in their personality. And Daniel's so funny. Max is honestly very funny, but like in a dry humor sort of situation.
In a different way.
Where, like Daniel sort of has like
Daniel's like outwardly goofy. Like, that's just his personality.
Yeah, you're right. He's like outwardly goofy, versus Max is like very, very, very funny, but very deadpan, dry humor. And I think Max and Yuki have such a good energy, because Yuki is just so adorable, so funny, a ball of joy, but like also honestly has a very similar temper to Max. Like, both of them have worked on it. Both of them have gotten better about it. Sometimes it shows very dramatically for both of them. And I don't know if you saw the clip. It was like a few races ago where Max was like, if I were going to do, was it 24 Hour of Le Mans? He was saying there was something, he wanted Yuki on his team for another race, because he was like, you're so light, it would really help. Like, you're so little.
Oh, yeah.
um, I just think they have good chemistry. I really enjoy them when they put the 4 of them together. I think the 2 of them are just really fun. And I
Yeah.
think it could do well for, like, the overall likability of Max and Red Bull, I think. Like, there's right now this energy of, like, kind of we saw the conversation where people said that Lando's, like, not mean enough to be a world champion, and Lando was sort of like, "I don't wanna be mean, I wanna be myself." And I think there's this energy right now and it's a perception, really, I will say, like, having hung out with the Red Bull team, like, everybody's so nice, everyone's got, like, a good vibe, they want to win, they're very, like, championship oriented and champion mentality, but I wouldn't say that they're, like, Max isn't so cutthroat that he's not gonna have friends, like, he's not gonna be there's a narrative that's very much, like, spun about that. I think Max objectively has friends on the grid. Him and Lando are very great friends, and they have been able to, like, work through their problems on track. They've been able to discuss things off track and still be friends, which is quite impressive. And I think also, like, sometimes I really love watching Max and Lewis talk to each other because they kind of trade barbs, they trade jokes, but, like, very clearly have, respect for each other. I think Max gets this sort of bad rap of like ruthlessness or like no desire to be friendly, and I don't think that that's the case. And I think him and Yuki would really change that energy because they have a dynamic between the two of them that is very fun. So
I think Red Bull underestimates like the appeal that bringing Yuki into that team would have. Like,
yeah,
I don't know if they fully grasp just how many people, like fans, love Yuki.
yeah,
And I don't like it wouldn't maybe bring in the sponsorship money that Daniel would have. But if you're talking about like fan pull, I think it would be huge. And I mean, I have to believe that they just aren't recognizing that.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure like teams like this, and I think that's also sometimes I'm always like it's sort of like what's the word I'm looking for? Like armchair expert, backseat driver, all those different things. Like sometimes we're so on the outside that I'm like, obviously it's a multi-million-dollar corporation is what a Formula One team is. I'm sure there are numbers that are figured out. They look at how much merch everyone sells. They look at the amount of sponsorship money that comes in, these different types of things. But sometimes I do want to be like, can we get a fan poll? Can we just get like, can you just ask a whole bunch of people who would you rather see in this seat? And then we should pick. Because I think, sometimes we're in it for the memes. That's all. And also I do think
Yeah.
they'd have a better, it would be a better support system, I think, for Max in a way that I think could be really exciting to watch. So I don't know.
Yeah. I
Um,
agree. We'll have to wait and see.
yeah, we will. Other qualifying shock was George Russell, P17. I will say that I just switched into using F1 TV, so I had the team radio on and a couple of other things, which had I not had, I would not have realized that when on the broadcast they just had George like complaining about the fuel. But prior to that, he actually bailed out on both of his flying laps. Like he had 2 full flying laps that he bailed out on and didn't finish, and there didn't seem to be a reason why. And then when he got to his last chance, he didn't have enough fuel and then complained about that over the radio, which he did retract in kind of post quali conferences, and also at the end he sort of said over the radio, "Sorry guys, that's on me." But it was interesting. I was surprised to see him bail out like that because I don't know where the lack of confidence just in it wasn't like a racing situation. There wasn't danger. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, it's a I would say rare mistake from George
Yeah.
to end up being in a situation like that. And maybe he just made some small mistakes on the lap, or there was something that he wasn't feeling and wasn't feeling right. I don't know if I know it was changeable track conditions, so maybe that played a part in it. But it was very strange to see him in that position, especially after winning in Austria. And then, I mean, unfortunately, he had to retire the car in Silverstone, but qualifying on pole, looking on track
Yeah.
to win the race, all of that. He's been on a really good run of form. So this was a bit of a shocker.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I thought honestly, like Silverstone, it wasn't a retire because he did anything wrong. It was just a car retire. I didn't expect it to really shake him in any strong way, but it was interesting. I think his focus seemed to be a little off this week. He did give sort of like a comment saying like if the car had been in this state, Lewis never would have left. Like he definitely wouldn't have, gone to Ferrari, which I thought was surprising because I was kind of like it never really seemed like the decision was about the car. It very much seemed like it was about other factors. And I don't know if maybe we're also hearing rumors about him potentially looking to go to Audi in 2026 if they don't get Carlos. Lewis is leaving, obviously, which leaves one seat open, but then George's contract is up at the end of next year. And so I don't know if he's feeling pressure thinking that they may be looking for two new drivers, or that they may be looking at a driver that they want to come in for long term and George ends up being the only one with a year, versus whoever comes in second. Like, are they looking to bring Carlos in, and keep him for a longer period of time and then give George's seat to Kimmy? I think there are definitely rumors swirling that I was sort of like, oh, whatever. But then George's head sort of seemed to be out of the game this weekend.
That's something I didn't even think about, but I'm sure has to play a huge part, because until he figures out who's going to be in that seat with him next year, there's just so much uncertainty. And I've even seen like the resurgence of the Max to Mercedes rumors this week.
Yeah.
So that's like the ultimate threat if you're George Russell. I think that he's still in a pretty strong position if it's Carlos coming in next year, or even Kimi, because for those first couple of years, at least, Kimi is still going to be adjusting to being an F1. But Max would be a huge shakeup and would be something that would completely unsettle George and his position on the team.
Yeah, I honestly, I still think I would be shocked, but I do think regardless of whether it happens or not, Toto's singular focus on making it happen would be a threat to George, because you know that he wants one of those seats to go to Kimi regardless. And Toto consistently campaigning for Max, like offering Max everything that Lewis wanted, continuing to talk about it in interviews and press conferences, saying Max never really said that he was committed, and then Max being like, I'm committed, and Toto being like, did he say that though? And everyone's like, yeah, he did, like word for word, that's what he said. And I think also, like, when you have a week like this where Max is not performing and he's frustrated with Red Bull and with the team, it's gonna bring those fears to the forefront. And you're right, that is the ultimate threat to George. If Toto now has it in his head that he actually could get Max in some capacity within the next couple of years, if you're George, there is no seat for you in your mind, potentially, because you've lost 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton over determining that you want that seat to go to Kimi Antonelli. And if you're George, you think, okay, well, they were willing to sacrifice Lewis over me for Kimi Antonelli. That feels positive, that feels good, that feels like I'm the future of this team. But now I think we can get Max. Okay, then that means you just sacrificed Lewis over Kimi. You're not keeping me over Kimi. I think you're right. I think it is like a situation where like that has to be playing in George's head, and he has to be trying to plan ahead for that.
I mean, I see Max leaving F1 before going to Mercedes. Like, I think Max retiring early is a more likely scenario than Max going to Red Bull and driving somewhere else. That's just me.
I agree.
But I
agree.
I mean, George Russell, I completely understand where George is coming from, especially because all George has ever wanted, it seems like, is to be the number one driver at Mercedes.
Yeah.
And it seems like he thought he had it, but everything that Toto is saying out in the media is making him think, well, Toto doesn't actually see me as the number one driver. And that has to like hurt him a lot.
I think, like, to be fair to George, that's everyone's dream, right? Is to be the number one driver. It's the same problem Carlos is having with signing another contract, and to be the focus of a team is everyone's goal. Like, your first goal is get to Formula One, and we've seen, like, you see the extreme level of sacrifice that people are putting in. Like, one of the big things that happened this weekend that I think maybe got overshadowed by the race itself was, like, this is the anniversary of Esteban Ocon's first win in Formula One at Hungary, and like, we had this like very touching moment where they delivered Esteban's winning car to his family's home, and that was a big deal because it now sits in the garage of a home that they now own, but a home that they didn't have because they sold their home to keep Esteban in racing and to get him to Formula One. And so you see this like extreme level of sacrifice that people are going through just to get to one of those 20 seats. You have Oscar talking about that after this race as well, to like, when they're asking, is this win everything that you hoped it would be? And he's like, yeah, I mean, like, as a kid, you're making a decision to leave your country. Like, you can't really become a Formula One driver if you stay in Australia. And so you have these guys and these whole families that really have made this big sacrifice. And I think it sucks because for 10 of them, you're not the focus of the team. You're the other guy, And I think George, again, to be fair to him, it's everyone's problem. It's Carlos's problem. It's Daniel's downfall. His choice to leave Red Bull is completely focused on the fact that he was becoming the second driver to Max and that he didn't want to be. He wanted to be first somewhere else, and chasing that, it really has turned his career upside down. And I think it gets in the way. It becomes like a blinder situation unless you're willing to be someone like Valtteri, who eventually accepts that you're going to be second to someone else and finds a way to make that work for your career. I think it sucks race, because for George specifically, and I've probably been a little bit harder on George on the show in general than I have on other people, because I think it's because George does have good potential and he makes a lot of last minute mistakes. And it's like it's so close, and then you have everything in front of you, and you just sort of drop the ball. And I think he's past that point in his career where he should still be having those problems. And so that's where I get frustrated with him. But for George, when you look at his trajectory of like, okay, he did his time at Williams. He was sort of like handed this second seat at the time when they actually pushed Valtteri out, who had been a really good team player, and Lewis wanted Valtteri to stay, and it felt like this sort of changing of the guard in a way that we now know turned into a real big mess for for Lewis's relationship with Mercedes overall. And so you look at it and like, if you're George, okay, I went through all the ranks, I got myself into Formula One, I did the junior team, I became the more important driver there, I proved myself, I earned my seat. All signs point to they want to move to a younger team, they want to move to the next generation, and I'm the one that's going to usher that generation in. And then you go as far as to choose objectively choose George over Lewis in terms of like who's getting that seat, who's staying at Mercedes. And then you think, okay, I'm pretty cemented. And then your boss is talking about getting the world champion in, and the person that he believes to be the next version of Max Verstappen in. It's a hard one. I don't know that my headspace would be great either.
No, because if you're George, as we just said, he's done everything right. And he's in the position where it still might not be enough, or at least in his head, Toto might not be perceiving it as enough. So, yeah. I mean, hopefully he had a great recovery drive in the race, him and Checo both. So hopefully both of them will have their heads back on straight again after this weekend, and we can see them get back to where they both should be as far as their race performance.
Fingers crossed. I do think next week is sort of not for George really. I think next year, obviously he's locked in, and I think it'll be more of a conversation. George's situation, I think, will be more of a conversation next year when you're looking at whoever his new teammate is and then whoever's on the table. If Mercedes goes Carlos, if they go Max, somehow, if they go Kimi, who is he fighting for? I think that's really next year for him. But with Checo, obviously, we've also seen, and always take it with a grain of salt, but Helmut Marko has come out and said, we're having a conversation after Spa about that seat and about that situation. So, and also Daniel, came out and said, I'm treating these next two races as the most important in my career. So all signs point to a decision being made in that break that we're about to have after Spa. And, I hopefully, fingers crossed, Checo can at least give himself a fighting chance to make the conversation interesting.
I hope for that too. I think he's done too much in his Formula One career, and he at least deserves to have more of a fighting chance to keep his seat.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how long it goes. Like, there's so much of a conversation of replacing him right now, like moving him, like, sorry, season's over type of situation. It'll be interesting to see if that's the case. After this, he did now, like, Lewis has jumped 2 positions in the driver standings over George and Checo both. So Checo now has dropped down to 7th. So not super promising. Could have been worse if George had a better performance. He would have been 8th. So it definitely could always be worse. Fingers crossed. All of that being said, we've now kind of beat the beginning of the race, pre-race and the end of the race to death. So let's talk about everything in between. I will say, I think the biggest point of this race that I think is going to be the conversation when it comes to Oscar versus Lando and the win and everything like that. And it's also what Lando was talking about in the post-race press conference. The open of the race, Oscar has a great takeoff. Lando is sort of split between Oscar and Max and has to make a decision.
The whole narrative around today's race could have been completely different if Lando would have handled that start differently.
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple of different issues. Like, we had a false start that he didn't get penalized for, but objectively absolutely was a false start. He's had some issues off the line, and I don't know if it's his reaction time. I don't know if it's that that's just his weak point. Every driver has a weak point, but it does feel like that's where he feels like he lost the race. And it's hard because it's like, you don't know that for sure. You don't know that and I think that's the frustration of this race, actually, as we get into it. Like, we can talk through Lando and Oscar, and then we can talk through everybody else, I guess, because that's really what the race was Lando and Oscar by themselves and everybody else kind of doing their thing separately. But the thing that I think is so frustrating, like, in my notes, I literally have lap by lap where like things were being called and happening, and it was so frustrating because the frustration of it in the end, how many times can I say the word frustrating in context of this? But I think where it comes from is that it is a you'll never know. We didn't have a chance to watch them race properly. The calls were being made in very weird places. You've got all the way, like literally just looking at my lap by lap notes, Oscar goes off track 3 times in this race. You have a great start. Oscar obviously, like between the two of them, quote unquote, wins the start. Then you have, Oscar's off track on lap 33, losing time there. You've got like around lap 39, they tell Lando it's fine to keep racing until the mid 40s, meaning like, okay, free to race, do your thing. Then you've got like 46, that's when they pit Lando, and they're saying that that's to cover for Hamilton. They've left Oscar out to cover for Max. And I will be honest with you, I think I already said this online, but like I genuinely thought they were lying. I thought they were lying to Oscar, because when you look at it, like there was no threat of Hamilton and there was no threat of Max at that point. Like they were both within the gap for a safety car. They very easily could have pitted Oscar, then pitted Lando, and they would have kept exactly the same situation as they then created a problem for themselves. And I genuinely thought at that point when they called Lando in, I genuinely thought they were lying to Oscar, and they were like, "Oh yeah, don't worry, we're gonna flip it back. We're gonna flip it back." I thought at that point they were making like a long call strategy to try to give Lando a fighting chance at catching Max, because it was not dangerous to the team overall to switch them at that point. I don't know how you felt about that call, but I was like, they're lying.
Well, first, I want to backtrack and say that it wasn't just Oscar's start. It was his entire first stint that he just executed really well. And I think that is important to touch on, because the biggest downfall that Oscar has had is that he just hasn't quite figured out his tire management yet. And he managed his tires in that first stint brilliantly. And I think he managed his tires well in all of his stints, but in the second and third stints, he did make his mistakes. To me, that call just like didn't make sense. Like I understand the call of bringing in Lando to cover off Lewis, but why the team thought that Lewis was a threat is what made no sense to me, because Lewis was like 8 seconds behind at that point, fighting with Max and Charles. Like there was no way that Lewis was going to undercut them. And so it, to me, just seemed like a giant mess. Like, I don't know if there was some miscommunication, or maybe it was like on Lando's side of the garage, them kind of just saying this to like maybe try to like sneaky pull off the undercut on Oscar. But if you're going to make that call, you need to communicate the reason to both parties and make it clear to Lando that we are doing this from a strategic perspective because we think that you need to hold off Lewis. Oscar needs to cover off Max. But if you end up undercutting Oscar, you will switch the positions back. I think that's the thing that needed to be communicated to Lando initially. And maybe it was. I haven't listened to all the team radios, but it doesn't seem like it was. And I think that would have resolved all of the issues, because I think Lando was under the impression that it was just going to be a free-for-all once they both had pitted, when that clearly wasn't the intention from the McLaren pit wall.
Yeah, I think based on team radio, from what I could tell, Oscar was told that Lando was going to undercut him, that they would swap the positions back.
Yeah.
But Lando very
wasn't.
much was not. Yeah. And it's the thing that was very odd about it to me is that if you listen to like Andrea afterwards, like he's very much like, yeah, I mean, this was always the plan. We were going to do it. And like you listen to the radio calls and you put yourself in Lando's shoes. Literally 6 laps before, he's being told it's fine to fight until the mid 40s. 46 to me is mid 40s. So you're pitting someone when you've just told them, like, and I think that's where like the irritation comes on Lando's side. And I think I've seen a lot of people calling Lando's behavior unsportsmanlike, and just personally, I genuinely disagree, because I was watching it and I was like, me personally, I would be like, mail me my trophy, like find me whatever you want, I'm going home. Like that was...
In the moment, I feel like it was frustrating, because like seeing it from Oscar's point of view, you're like, this is what Oscar has promised. But like, so I feel like I was frustrated with Lando in that moment because of that. But I completely understand where he was coming from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess what's frustrating is I'm seeing the unsportsmanlike, and like I saw some pretty hateful messages actually, which I thought, I think unsportsmanlike conduct is a really wild term to throw around over something like this. Unsportsmanlike conduct is much more like, I think when you're talking about about that term when you're talking it because that term is also like an actual foul you can get in other sports where it like affects the
Yeah.
game, right? Like it's unsportsmanlike
Well, Lando
conduct
has
is
gotten a penalty for that for
exactly.
like, I think it was in Canada last year for doing like slowing down too much in the middle of a safety car so that he
Yeah.
could get more of like a pit advantage.
Exactly. So it's like that's an actual like and I'm not trying to like, police the way people want to talk about things as fans, but I do think when you're using a term that is like actually something that can be a penalty, you're talking about things that are very much like you can say you don't like the way that like you don't like his attitude or you found it to be petty or childish or whatever, but when you're asking someone to who is the closest possible person to possibly changing who wins the World Drivers' Championship. You're talking about a 7-point differential in first and second. You're talking about someone who's been told up until he was told to pit that it's okay to race, it's okay to fight for that position, and then not told that he's going to have to give the position back when he pits, gets the understanding that honestly, like, because everyone else knew it, when you pit Lando first, you're gonna undercut Oscar, and no one's told him he's gonna have to give this back. It comes off as though this is the strategy call we're making. Lando's gonna win this race. And then you put him back out there, then you wait until Oscar comes back in, which they held him out for like another 2 laps before he actually pitted. In Lando's shoes, oh, my team wants me to win this race. Like
Oh,
now, you
100%.
know what I mean? And then also the other part that I think is the mistake that they made, if they were planning to give the position back, they should have done it immediately. They should have told him before he went in, and then if you tell him before he goes in and then he doesn't give it back, then yeah, he is wrong, like, just objectively. Okay, fine. But if they would have told him, "You have to change the cars as soon as we pit, or we're gonna stack, or we're gonna do this, or they had pitted Oscar first. The part that makes it more complicated is that Lando had much faster pace in the final stint after they both went in for their second pit stop, and when you look at that, it was close enough that if they would have just pitted Oscar first, you would have had Lando potentially catch up. And then at that point, you let them fight, make a call or whatever. And if Lando's the one that has a better pace, then you let him take the win and it feels earned and that's the situation. But that's not what they did. They instead like really made it into the situation that I think just put both drivers in such a negative tone, right? It makes Oscar seem as though he was handed his first win by his teammate, which now they all have to go into press and say, well, no, that's not the case. Like Oscar would have won. I didn't hand him anything, blah, blah, blah. And then you also put yourself in a position where if you do by some miracle, if Max continues to fall in races, and especially if the second car is not scoring points, you're getting closer and closer to potentially catching Red Bull for the constructors championship. But again, if Lando can outperform Max for the rest of the season, you're going to get to a position where those 7 points might actually really make a difference. And then it always comes back to this call that you can very much blame on the team, and you can very much blame on Andrea and on Will, and it just sucks because it's like they've now set themselves up in a position where if they perform to the level that they hope to perform to, this race is going to come back to bite them.
Yeah. I think the two mistakes that were made were they had this strategy in their head and they just didn't communicate it to Lando.
Yeah.
That's mistake number one. Mistake number two is it's almost like McLaren doesn't fully realize how good of a position they're in on track because there was nothing to worry about from Lewis and Max at all. Like, but them thinking that that was still a threat, it's like
Yeah.
they're hindered by their like, oh, we're still second place, third place, whatever mentality. But that's not the case anymore. They are clearly the fastest car on track right now. And they have been for 3 races now. And it seems like they're going to continue to be. And I think that that's something that they need to get into their heads so that they can start making calls to win, not like making these paranoid calls that seem to be what drove everything today.
I agree, and I think, like, I guess maybe that's the other part that, bugs me so much about the call, is that I really want McLaren, and I feel like McLaren needs to be in this mentality of, we are fighting for both the Constructors' Championship and the Drivers' Championship. Lando is close enough, or we have the actual possibility, so it's a large gap, but if McLaren truly believes they have the possibility to do this, like, I do kind of wanna see them be a little bit more, like, strategic long term. I honestly
Yeah.
kind of do wanna see them say, "Look, Oscar, like, I know you're gonna win, but objectively, like, we need these points. If we're going to have a chance to catch Max, we need these points. I know people disagree with that a lot of times, and the argument is like it was Lando's term to be a team player and all of those things. And I will give Lando that I think he tried really hard to not answer this question when it was asked in the post-race press conference, which was basically like the question was, if you guys are going to challenge Max for this drivers championship, at what point do you think McLaren needs to start making those calls to put you first and to prioritize your points? And he just basically didn't answer the question. He was like, I'm not going to answer that. Today wasn't the day, blah blah blah. And I respect that, because I think, what good does that do to answer other than to just take the spotlight away from Oscar, to take the wind out of his sails even more than it already was, and to make your team look bad. But that call, that choice not to, the choice to undercut Oscar and then not commit to that decision very much shows that, to me, they only believe they can win the constructors championship. They don't believe they can win the drivers championship, because if they did, they would be 100% trying to get every single possible point spread that they could between Lando and Max.
And I mean, I would imagine that that's a conversation that they're going to be having in their debrief that they had today and moving forward, because that drivers championship is, yes, it is a huge long shot, but it's clearly something that Lando himself believes in. So
yeah,
I think that I'm sure he's going to be communicating that message to the team. I mean, I think he's already kind of proved with his statements today, things he said on the radio, that is how he feels. And I mean, I hope that the team back him in that, as much as I think that Oscar also has great championship winning potential. He might have to take a back seat this year. And as unfortunate as that is, that's the reality. And I don't think it's going to take away from what people think of Oscar as a driver or make him any less than. I think that things are just shaping up to be a really weird year this year, and McLaren needs to take advantage of that. And maybe next year, if McLaren shows up to testing in Bahrain and is immediately ahead of everyone, maybe let those two race it out for a little bit and have that open competition for a championship between the two of them. But I don't think this year is the year to do that. They have to prioritize, as much as they don't want to. And they've said they don't want to, but it's just not realistic in the position they're in.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's like, I think it's possible that after this race, for the rest of the season, we are going to see a shift in that conversation, because I do think everyone's sort of like, I mean, it was said on the broadcast multiple times. I'm not like making up a new perspective. Like, the only person who has a real chance of catching Max is Lando, and it is a slim chance, but it is a chance. And every week that Max falls and Lando rises, every single one of those points matters. And I think I would hate to see it become a situation where we get to the last 2-3 races of the year and we're like, they're within 7 points, 8 points, 6 points. Like, if Lando loses this championship by anywhere from 0 to 6 points, today is the day that they threw it away. And I think that sucks. And I do think it's this conversation of, as a team, when is it fair and when is it overall strategy? And I just objectively think, like, a lot of people have said it, you said it today, like, McLaren is not used to fighting for championships anymore. And now that they are, they're not thinking long term. They don't really know how to make that decision. I do think it is ironic that the criticism that Lando got on Thursday for media day was, you're too nice to be a world champion. And he said, I don't want to not be nice. I want to be a team player. I want to have fun. I want to be goofy. And being nice and following team orders and being a team player could be a situation that causes him to lose it this year.
I think that putting up the fight that he did proved that he at least has that like championship winning mentality, because I think that's like kind of going along with the he's too nice. Like, the criticism he gets is like, or not even criticism, but like people question whether he like has that edge to him, that like extra competitive edge that people like Max and Lewis and Schumacher like have. And I think he has that. I think he's proven that. And now it's just going to be up to McLaren to help to get him there. And I have to say that I don't think today would have gone down the way it did if Zach Brown was there. That's just my 2 cents. I think things would have been completely.
Agree with you.
I think that whether it be one way or another, Zach would have gotten on the radio, shut that down, and it would have been how it was. And that's it. And I'm sure that when they got Zach on the phone, well, maybe, I don't know if they've gotten Zach on the phone because he's been busy at IndyCar, but Zach is going to straighten the team orders whatever situation out and be like, listen, I'm going to back Lando on this. If he thinks he can win the drivers' championship, I'm going to stand by him on that. And I think that's the direction we should take this season.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of criticism you can make about Zach Brown, but I think when it comes to his Lando, he's going to back Lando 100%. I think he'll back Oscar 100% too, but he's built up such a strong relationship with Lando that I think he believes in what Lando believes for himself.
Also, if we're going to be just so objective about it, I think Zach backs winning at all costs. I think that's part of why he's, you know what I mean? I think that's part of why he's in Toronto this weekend instead of here, for this race in Hungary. I think the Arrow McLaren situation, we don't have to get into it because not everyone listening is going to know what we're talking about. But IndyCar, if you want to look into it, the very short version is they've had a rotating door of drivers for their third car in IndyCar, and the reason this is all a mess is because you had one of them brought back this weekend, and they're making these short-sighted quick decisions of, this person's, shiny and I think he can win, or I think he can win, I think he can win. They're picking every person that they think could be the next winner, and they're not giving anybody sort of the chance to develop. It's actually very similar to some of the things that we saw with Red Bull early on when we talk about Pierre and Alex and how quickly they were moved out of their seats. Zach, whether it's reporting, car changes or raising different different personal issues. And I think Zach believes in winning no matter what it costs. And so if Zach comes back and looks at it and says, or is convinced by Lando or by the team or whatever, yes, I think Lando can win the championship, we will see an extreme change in the way that the drivers are treated and prioritized. For this call to have been made, I have to believe that Zach was involved in some case. He had to have been on the phone, he had to have been watching the race. They weren't at the exact same time. I don't know. But this weekend, McLaren had Formula E, they had Formula One and IndyCar all on top of each other. So I'm sure the man was stretched thin, hoping for championships across the board. We also had Pato, one of their IndyCar drivers, get into a very bad accident. And that was very scary and stressful. And I think it's been a rough day if you are the CEO of McLaren. But I think if Zach is made to believe that Lando can win, it will become quite cutthroat at McLaren in terms of the way that the drivers are prioritized, what comes next. And I also was kind of frustrated with Andrea's interview afterwards, because he basically was like, yeah, he was asked, did you consider getting on the radio to make the call? And he was like, no, I knew Lando would do it. And I'm being facetious, but he basically said no, I knew Lando would do it. And also I told Will, you deal with that. That's your thing to deal with. And that to me really does suck, because if Andrea would have just gotten on the radio and said, Lando, reestablish the order at this lap. After that, you guys are free to fight. If you think you have the pace, then catch him. I'm not telling you you have to let Oscar win. I am telling you have to fix this decision that we made because it was a strategy call, whatever. If you have someone firmly get on the radio, because that's the other thing. Even with Will, they never clearly said,
they never told him do this.
Yes. They never objectively came out and just said, team orders, switch the positions back. I mean it. It was all of this pleading and uncomfortable, I know you'll do the right thing. Think about our meetings on Sunday mornings. What are you talking about? Just tell him what you want him to do. Just say it, make the call, and then let them race after that.
And I think that the way that they handled the radio is what turned it into a very frustrating situation, and a situation where you maybe weren't getting the best out of Lando, let's say, in his terms of his responses, all of that. And that's why I feel like if Zach was there and able to get on the radio, whether it be on the radio to Oscar saying, you know what, Lando made a point, we think that unfortunately we're going to maybe prioritize him for this driver's championship bid, or getting on the radio to Lando and saying, listen, switch the positions back. All of this frustration and chaos could have been avoided. And it was the pleading that made, I think, McLaren look the worst.
Yeah.
It wasn't the fact they were trying to call team orders. It was the constant back and forth.
It was the fact that they never called team orders. That's the issue.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's the issue. Just call them. If you're going to make that decision, it sucks for everyone involved, but just call it. Make the actual call. Because I think the worst one, when I was rereading the radio transcript, was when they told Lando it doesn't matter, and he said, "It actually might to me,"
Matters to
like,
me.
referencing the
Yeah.
7 points and also referencing the race, like, yeah, it does matter, like, you can't I don't know, and I think that I don't know how you feel about this, but I do wonder because we're saying, like, "Oh, if Zach had been there to be on the radio," Zach is not the team principal, and he never has been, like, that's Andrea's job, like, it is genuinely the job of the team principal to get on the radio and say, "This is the call." I think sometimes we conflate Zach into that position partially because he makes himself that like, he puts himself in that position
That
a lot of
figure.
times. Yeah, he puts himself into that, like, "This is my team," he is very forward facing for a CEO position, but, like, if you are not familiar with Formula 1 and the way the hierarchy works, like, the confusing part about it is when you look at Toto Wolff, he's the CEO and the team principal, so a lot of times you have him making those calls and he's the only one making the call, but wanting Zach Brown to be the one to make the call versus Andrea is like expecting Lawrence Stroll to get on the radio at Aston Martin. They have the same position, and I think that's the part where I get kind of frustrated with McLaren because or at least I was frustrated today because, yeah, Zach's not there, but you have a team principal whose job it is to make those calls, and then in post race interviews, he's saying like, "Yeah, I just didn't want to. I told Will to do it." It's like,
Yeah.
"No, that's your job. Your job is to make those hard calls and to deal with it, and when you have a driver who doesn't agree, it's your job to tell him, 'I don't care.'" Will can't really do it as an engineer. Like, he is like, pleading with Lando, "Please, please, please think about our team." Like, the one that really killed me was think about our Sunday meetings, and I was like, what's he supposed to think about? The fact that, like, Oscar may not wanna pass him the sugar for his coffee? Like, what are we talking about right now? You know what I
What is
mean?
going
Like,
on in these team meetings that is going to be different if Lando doesn't give this position
yeah,
back?
I was like, "Think about our Sunday morning meetings." I'm like, "Okay." I mean, I'm sure that meant something specific, but the way it came off, and that's, I think, what we're talking about.
I'm sure there's some sort of like internal morale thing that they talk about at these meetings that Will was referencing. But on one hand, I see Stella initially pushing it off to Will because Will has the longer relationship with Lando,
Sure.
like as a driver and an engineer, and we'll get into this with Max and GP, like there's already that established rapport. But at a certain point, enough is enough, and he should have stepped in. I think that's
Yeah.
really how to sum it up.
He should have, and I think also the other part that's hard about it is, like, Max and GP is a good reference point because, Max knows GP's on his side, and that's why they're able to have that kind of back and forth, but I think when you talk about, like, driver and race engineer, to some degree, as we always say, like, your teammate is your teammate, but they're also your direct biggest competition, and so your team on your side of the garage, you feel like that's your team, like, Will should be on like, for in Lando's point of view,
Fighting for
Will should be on my
Lando.
side. Yeah, you should be fighting for me. I'm giving you the information back. I'm faster. It does matter for me. These points do matter for my chances of beating Max. And Lando's sending that information back. And again, this is where I get to the point where people are calling him unsportsmanlike. As a driver, you're talking to your race engineer who's supposed to then go to your team principal and your team strategist and fight for you. And so as a driver, Lando's sitting there and he's saying, "I have position. I need the 7 points. I am faster. Why would we swap? And why didn't they bring Oscar in first if they wanted Oscar to win?" Then in your mind, you're saying, "Okay, I'm giving you all the information to tell you why I should win this race." Will should go and take that back to Andrea. Andrea should say, "You know what? You're right," or "You're wrong," and come back and say, "This is the situation." And I think that's like this delicate balance of yeah, like your race engineer should take your information and root for you. And then obviously the team made the decision, but then that is the point where it's like, okay, he needs to come in and call it because had they just called it at the beginning and what if, but had they brought Oscar in first, had they made the swap immediately, all these different things, then you have the ability to say, well, Lando, you never would have caught him. You lost the race. Sorry. Or Lando, you tried to catch him and that's fine, but you didn't have the pace. Oscar had you beat this entire race. And then you also have, like we've mentioned, Oscar made a couple of mistakes in his last 2 stints. He did go off the track 3 times. Like there are these moments where it's like you've created doubt where it didn't need to be there. And I do think at a certain point, the team principal's job is to come on and make that call.
At one point, Will said something that gave me the impression it was like, don't make us like actually ask you to do it. Like that was like the vibe of his message. Like he didn't, that's not exactly what he said, But it was like,
Yeah.
don't make us actually tell you to do it, was like the impression that his radio message gave off. And that was just like a weird thing, because to me, yeah, as we've been saying, if you want it done, tell them to do it and get it done. Like,
yeah,
it was just weird. I don't know. Like, Lando's not just going to hand it back because he's a competitor. No driver would hand it back unless they're actually told to. So being like, don't make us actually ask, is just added to and that was like, I think one of the last messages before Lando actually did end up swapping the positions. But everything about that exchange and how it went down was just so bizarre. And I feel like that it's not the fact that Lando gave the position back, it's that entire exchange for me that like ruined it and kind of like left that sour taste in my mouth.
I think like, again, we'll see what happens starting next week, but I do hope to see them start to believe that they have a chance at winning the championship. Well, I think that seals like the biggest story of the race, but I think we should double back and talk about Max a little bit, because I don't know. So I have, by the internet, been accused of being both a Max hater and a Max stan, to the point that they believe I'm making, calls that are just in favor of Max. And so I'm again not positive how you can give off both vibes at the exact same time. But today was hard as someone who has really like defended Max in certain spaces, and I think like it was hard to watch the way that he was behaving on the radio, but also the radio to me, it's really just like back to old Max. Like when he's fighting for position, when he's not in first, like he is complaining, he is loud, and he's never happy, because if you're a championship driver, you're never happy with not first. So I think with Max, like his radio behavior definitely was over the top today, but it's never shocking to me. I did pull a couple of quotes for us to have, but the worst one was, "It's quite impressive how we let ourselves get undercut and then just completely fuck my race." And then the other one was, I didn't write the whole thing down because they blurred out most of it because he dropped the F-bomb every other word. Yuki used to have the same problem, if we're being so fair, right? Like,
yeah,
some people can contain themselves. Yeah. And we talked about this earlier. Him and GP have this relationship where, they can go out for drinks tonight and nobody's going to have a problem. Like, this is just the way that they discuss things. And, I don't know. I think like a lot of times the difference with Formula One versus another sport, like if you had mic'd up Michael Jordan throughout the entirety of his career, I don't know that everyone would have thought he was the nicest guy.
Yeah.
I think sometimes championship mentality, brings this behavior out of people. So that's all I'll say about the radio. I don't know how you feel.
I do have to say, on the point about the radio from Max, where he was like, I'm just like, you guys like screwed me, I'm just trying to save my race. I do believe that, and this was after Max had been yelling at GP for quite a while.
Yeah.
GP was like, I think he said something to the effect of like, nice introduction to your tires, like insinuating that Max like had pushed too hard initially. So like, it is a two-way street in some ways, because like there are better ways that GP could have delivered that. But I think that he was kind of just like, we're already at a 10. So like, I'm just going to be sassy with you because we're already there. We're already bickering. So like, I'm going to say what's coming into my head, which I think is like, I mean, it's great. But like, that one is like maybe a little bit understandable because like GP did sass Max first in that circumstance. But this isn't anything new. This is what we saw of Max in 2021, 2020. I wasn't shocked by it, because we've kind of been seeing it build to this point gradually as his frustrations with the car and the team like grow more and more. I just feel like, at least my thought on it is, I get you're frustrated. I get you want to win. I get you're a competitor, but having these outbursts on the radio in your 9th, 10th year in Formula One as a 26, 27-year-old, like, I just don't think that acceptable. And you have other drivers that have been in the similar positions where they're used to winning. They've been world champions, and then they get an awful car and they don't behave this way. I just think that's like my criticism of it, is that I understand where he's coming from, but you don't have to do this. I mean, and that's just him, and that's who he's always going to be. And I think people were just reminded of like, oh yeah, like this is kind of like who Max is, like when things aren't just like going smoothly like they have been for the past 2 years. I don't have a problem with Max screaming on the radio, just to set the record straight. I actually do find it hilarious. I have the problem with the emotional driving, because emotional driving turns into dangerous driving. And that's like, I don't want to see it cross the line. And I feel like with what we saw today with the emotional driving, it started to give off some like an air of like what we saw in 2021. And I'm like, I just don't want to turn it. I don't want this season to turn into Max emotionally driving every week and causing crashes because he's frustrated.
Yeah, I agree. Especially given like the information we've learned recently about the fact that like Max really suffered from that crash that you're referencing between him and Lewis, and for him to have had those vision issues for as long as he did afterwards. And I think like there is a point where things go too far, and I think Max's weakness can be driving, or is driving angry. That is like I said earlier, every driver has a weakness as a driver, and I think Max's weakness is when he's losing, he gets too angry to focus. And I think if he had listened to GP, if he had brought his tires in gradually, he probably could have caught both Charles and Lewis. But it's when he makes these decisions of it has to be right now, and if I don't take this chance right now, then I'm not going to get another one. That's where he makes these wrong calls, and he just gets too angry to the point that he can't listen to anyone. Okay, so then outside, I think those are the two ones that were like very much televised. I actually like some of the stuff that happened in the race was very much I had to go afterwards to go find what happened with everyone else, because there was enough at the front of the field that they kept the cameras there the whole time. With Ferrari, though, I was pleasantly surprised. Like me and Ferrari, me and Fred got together and we made but no, they made good strategy calls. They pitted at the right time. Everything seemed okay. I hate to jinx it, but
I know. I'm trying not to be Delulu, but I was like, that was actually best case scenario for Ferrari this weekend, I feel like. And I feel like Charles drove a relatively underrated race, because the fact that he was able to, I mean, granted, Max did make that mistake at the end that gave Charles P4 instead of P5. Mm-hmm. But I think that Charles made the most of that car for the first time in a while. And especially doing that entire last stint on mediums, which when they pit him at the same time as Lewis, I had questions, because he had so much more tire life compared to Lewis. And I was like, oh no, what are you doing? And then I saw him come out on mediums and I was like, oh no, this is over. But then like he was actually able to like make those mediums hold on well. And so I think that, or at least I'm hoping that Ferrari's maybe figuring things out, and we're going to start to see Charles and Carlos towards the top a little bit more regularly again.
I agree. I think like whatever bad energy we've had, I mean, it's not bad energy. It's the upgrades were a downgrade and we were having a lot of porpoising again. And that's the situation. There wasn't like confused. There was no like mystical situation, but I think the memes have been great, to be fair, of like Charles broke his curse, but at what cost? Only a new curse.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like, that, but I think hopefully they've been able to recover the problems that they gave themselves, and I'm hopeful tentatively that things will be okay for the rest of the season.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Same. And something must have happened when Charles and Pierre went to the Taylor Swift concert, where the energy shifted and Charles's bad energy just like got expelled, but then sucked back in by Pierre.
Poor guy. Oh, yeah, DNF out of nowhere. just retire the car. Sorry, buddy.
And I don't understand. I thought he basically replaced his entire power unit at Silverstone.
He basically replaced his entire car. Like,
right.
Like front to back, 50 grid penalty.
50 grid spot penalty places worth of repairs. Doesn't get to start the race, replaces more power unit parts, and has to retire it. Like,
maybe they were like, maybe we'll just take it all out. I kind of feel like maybe they gave him a Flintstone car. They were like, you don't need a floor, do you? Can you run this? Oh, your feet hurt? Come back in. Yeah,
I don't understand what is happening. Not even just with Alpine. They did make that mistake with leaving Pierre and Esteban in during qualifying, but like there is something seriously wrong with Pierre's car, it seems.
Agreed. And I'm like, I don't understand. Whatever was wrong with it before, maybe you should just pick it back up, because this is outrageous.
It's obviously worse.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I feel for him though. I really do, because it's like, he's like, yeah,
rough.
You know what?
It's rough.
Oh, it's like, again, at what cost? He won the battle of the two French guys for the Alpine seat, and he got all the love. And now what does he have? Literally nothing. Not a car. Not a P20.
Granted, Alpine hasn't the last two races performed well. I think it was Barcelona. They had a really good performance, and people are like, oh, maybe Alpine will be like in the picture for Carlos Sainz. And I lost it thinking about the fact that Pierre has worked so hard to be a number one driver, not even at a top team, at like a midfield team.
Yeah.
And Carlos could come in and rip that all away from him.
To be honest with you, the thing that kind of sucks is it doesn't actually matter where Carlos goes. That is the scenario. Wherever, if he
right,
doesn't take a year off, like, well, it's like, it actually,
unless he goes to Mercedes, where I think Mercedes, it would be like a fair fight sort of thing.
Kind of, but I think you're still, like we talked about George earlier, George considers himself to be in that slot for first position. So it's like, you've got, if he goes to Mercedes, you've got him basically taking the dream away from George. That has, as we said, I won't, recap everything, but we already said earlier on exactly like how he got there and where he feels. So you've got Carlos potentially taking that from George at Mercedes. If he goes to Alpine, he takes it from Pierre. If he goes to Williams, he takes it from Alex. If he goes to Audi/Sauber for the moment, he's kind of taking it from Nico, who's now moved over to be like the German driver for a German car brand. So it's like, wherever he goes, he's stealing someone's dream. So we'll see.
But it just, the story arc of Pierre finally achieving this and like beating out his lifetime rival just to have somebody potentially come in and like steal it from him was very funny to me.
God. Oh. Well, other highlights down the field. We've got V-Carb, which I thought was an interesting situation. You had Yuki pull out a pretty good race, honestly, overall. He was also the only driver, I believe, to manage a one-stop strategy this race.
I think so too, and which is very impressive.
Super, super impressive, honestly. Like, bad quality, obviously, but really, really brought it back. I was very impressed. But on the flip side, you've got Daniel Ricciardo, who felt very upset and slighted by the pitting strategy, was not happy about when he was called in, and fought it on the radio. When teams make calls that come off as wrong calls or that the driver disagrees with, you have Daniel basically being like, earlier on in the season, I needed a new chassis, I didn't have it, I wanted this change, I wanted that change, it's the car, it's this, it's the strategy. And I think we haven't had like a window of time with Daniel this season where he hasn't had somebody else to blame for where he's at. And I'm curious to see if this becomes another part of it. You know what I mean?
I mean, my thought on that strategy call made no sense, because I don't understand why you're pitting to prevent an undercut from drivers that were on softs. Yeah. It just made no sense to me. But V-Carb's problem is their strategy. They've had horrible strategy calls for both drivers all season long, and last year too, because I remember there being races last year where Yuki would be like on the same strategy as everybody else, running in like P7. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden I'm like, why is Yuki in P17?
Yeah.
because they did something like crazy. Like it was because they did something crazy with the strategy. Like that's the bigger problem for VCARB, is that they just can't seem to pull off a solid race for the most part where they're getting their strategy right throughout an entire weekend for both of their drivers.
Agreed. And I think that's like part of whatever plea Daniel's making. That's got to be part of it, like, quietly. So like, come on, you left me with these guys, you can't make any good calls, look what they're doing. And it's like, okay, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I think with the car stuff, he probably needed to take a little bit more accountability. But I mean, this one, I completely agree with him that this was outrageous. And
Agreed.
he should have scored points just like Yuki did.
Yeah, I agree with that. Last couple of big points. We already talked about this, but Checo put in a quite impressive drive, brought himself back up to P7, which I think he had to do to have any sort of hope for things going well for him in these conversations that are going to happen after Spa. And then you also have George fighting back from P17 to P8, which I got to hand it to him. Great work. And then there was a little bit of Alex Albon tension over the radio as well, which was not, I think Williams is also in a sticky situation with their second seat and their strategy calls and a couple of other things. And I think Alex has started to make himself a lot more vocal in his frustrations post contract being signed. And today was one of those.
Yeah, that is not something we see from Alex often. To be honest, I'm glad we're seeing it more because I think that he has a lot of potential as a driver. And sometimes it's almost like what we talked about with McLaren, like the team doesn't have the right mentality about what they're capable of and what he's capable of. And I think that can hinder him sometimes with the calls that they make and things like that. So I think he could have probably been in a position to score some points today. And the strategy just didn't allow for that. So, I mean, I think at least with Williams, they seem to be receptive to that feedback, especially coming from Alex. And so I think it's something that they'll definitely fix moving forward. But like, to me, Alex is one of those things where it's like, it's bad if Alex is coming on the radio to complain about it, sort of thing. That's how I feel about it, at least, because of just what his general demeanor is in the car and off the track.
I agree. He's just so calm and generally like respectful. And even to be fair, even today, he was like, both
still
him
very
and
respectful.
Lando, the way they were phrasing things. Yeah, I was like, it's so reasonable. You know what I mean? Tone's maybe not there, but
it's so very
the
British.
actual wording is yes, I love it. So yeah, that's what's going on there. Two post-race things that we didn't talk about already. One, like, which I thought was kind of cute. Lewis hit 200 podiums, which is something that nobody's ever done before, which is exciting. I thought when they asked him about it, it was quite funny because he was genuinely just like, and I think this is when we talk about like the differences between like mentality and personality with drivers. Lewis was just like genuinely happy for McLaren. He was like, that's my original family. Yeah. They like, he even gave them credit for the 200 podiums that he has, and he won his first championship there. And like, he really just wanted like McLaren to have the spotlight. Was aware of the tension, obviously, tried to diffuse a little bit of it with Lando, and Lando was not having it in the cool down room. And Lewis did kind of snap back at him, which I was like, okay. Sometimes you can feel the age difference, I think, when the two of them are in a room together. Because Lando is so quick to be like, what? And Lewis is like, okay, let's take a breath. But yeah, I thought it was nice to see Lewis kind of not be willing to take away from Oscar's win and from McLaren's glory, because he very much could have allowed them to make it all about him and his 200 podiums. And he had a couple of funny remarks, but it was really like, I'm very happy for McLaren, and I loved that. So
I wouldn't have expected anything different from Lewis, because it's just not in his nature to make a situation that is clearly so great for somebody else like about him.
Yeah.
Like, even if he did have that achievement, and it is a very notable one, like, I think that is just very telling of the character that we all know that he has, that that's how he behaved in the situation.
I agree. So that was nice to see. It is still nice to acknowledge the record. He's, been breaking records again, which is exciting to see him come back and kind of have that fire. I don't think he had a chance to win the race this weekend. I don't think they had the pace and the heat and everything like that. Though to be said, like he has won Hungary 8 times, so this would have been a second ninth title if he had done it.
Yeah, I think Spa definitely is going to be a track that suits the Mercedes car in the state that it's currently at better, because it is much more like Silverstone as far as its characteristics. So that is definitely a place where he's going to be challenging more. But I think the fact that he was still able to get a podium today at a track where their car was supposed to be weak, so to speak, is still very impressive. And I mean, shows that he still got it.
Agreed. And then my last little thing is just something that I was like, kind of made me pause. Did McLaren have an Oscar P1 hat made during the race? Like, what was that?
I saw you put that in the race notes and I was like, I haven't seen this. But then I was on Twitter and I saw like the video of Ted interviewing Oscar like down in the pit lane or whatever. And he had the hat on. And I'm like, where did that come from?
It was
I'm like,
sitting
I
on
don't
the, like,
understand.
when they, you know how
Well,
they
like, I know
normally
where it came from, but I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't understand. Like,
It was so odd
did
to
they
me
make
because,
that like at the beginning of the season and it's just been coming with
they've
them
been,
to
like,
every
carrying it
race? Like,
around. I would like to know, because I was like, it's such a little thing, obviously, but it was so weird because for anybody who didn't catch this, by the way, like if you look it up or if you look at any of the post-race like interviews, Oscar's wearing an embroidered black like dad cap that says like the O is in white and then the P1 is in orange and then it has the McLaren logo on it because it's like Oscar Piastri P1 OP1. But like I was like, where did they get this hat? Did they have it made today while they were arguing with Lando about giving the place back? Like, did someone go find an embroidery machine? Like, where
is that why
like
they argued so hard with Lando? Because they were like, we have somebody back in the motorhome making this hat already. We need Oscar to win.
Like, you don't understand. We've already hunted down an
We've
embroidery
already
machine.
paid for this hat. Zach Brown.
At Zach.
Give us answers on the OP1 hat.
Well, that being said, crazy race, wild amount of time. Predictions for next race or rest of season?
I know that McLaren seems to be pessimistic about whether like they're going to do well at Spa, or at least that's like the vibe I got from some of the post-race interview questions. But I think that it's just seems to be that they're strong everywhere. So even if they haven't been strong in Spa in the past, they seem to be strong everywhere this year. So I think that it's going to be another strong showing from McLaren, and we'll see if maybe at a less tricky track, the Red Bull can be a little bit more to Max's liking. But honestly, it's kind of like how we used to predict, like, well, Max is going to win as like the standard. Like, I think at least one McLaren driver being on the podium is like the new standard these days.
Yeah, I think we're going to see, because this is right before we take a break for the summer. And I think we're going to see a lot of risky performance from both Red Bull and VCarb. I think because that conversation about that second seat at Red Bull happens after Spa. I think you're going to see everybody really putting in what they have. And I don't know if that means we see high performance from them or if we see risky decisions made on Checo's side, on Daniel's side, trying to prove that they deserve that seat. So that's my concern about Red Bull and VCarb. I think we'll see McLaren continue to perform, but it will be interesting to see what the prioritization is of both drivers. And I will say my bold prediction now for the rest of the season is that I think those 7 points for Lando are going to matter.
I'm not as optimistic. I don't think it's going to come down to the 7 points. I do think it is going to be close. So it's going to be one of those situations where it's not just those 7 points, but it's mistakes from Silverstone. It's the crash that he had with Max in Austria, where it's just like these little accumulation of things, of these little mistakes that him and McLaren have made that will add up to a point that they matter.
Yeah. I think there's a race if they're willing to recognize that there's a race, if that makes sense.
I mean, just the fact that we're having the conversation about Lando potentially launching this second half of the season comeback for the Drivers' Championship is wild, because who would have thought that this is where we would be even when this season started? Like, It's just crazy that this is where we are at right now.
No, it really is. Oh, well, on that note, thank you for hanging out, Lindsay. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. Always fun to chat and debrief with you.
Of course. As always, if you don't want to watch these races alone, you can join the actual grid chat. I host a group chat of motorsports fans where fan behavior is encouraged, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. We watch these races live together, chat about breaking news, and of course, send each other an unhealthy amount of memes. If you'd like to join the grid chat, you can do so at tandemproductions.com/grid chat. There will also be a link to that in the episode description. Once you fill out the form on the webpage there, you'll get an invite via email from me. If you want to connect, let me know what you thought about the episode, or even just ask me another question that you'd like me to cover on the show. You can find me on all social media platforms at Marissa Kamari. And one of the best ways to connect with me is if you're listening to this podcast on Herd FM. You can find me in the community section on Herd FM, where my username is just my first name, Marissa. And once we follow each other, after every episode that you listen to, I'll be able to comment and have a conversation with you directly. So again, my username on Herd FM is Marissa. As always, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and thank you for joining the Grid Chat.